Please welcome our next speaker, Ramsey Kandah, a solutions architect. Today he will be presenting enterprise integration using Logic Apps. Please stick around after Ramsey's session for a live Q&A.
Hello everyone and welcome to DynamicsCon. My name is Ramsey Kandah, Solution Architect at Dynamic Consulting, and welcome to my session, Enterprise Integration using Logic Apps. This will be a technical session. I have a few slides here in the beginning to get us introduced, but we will be exploring the power of using Azure and Logic Apps to solve common integration or business process automation problems with Dynamics 365 products. In this demo, we will be building a solution for a car dealership which is using D365 customer engagement to manage servicing vehicles. We will create a two-way integration to allow the customer service rep to communicate with the customer using SMS. So what are Azure Logic Apps exactly? Azure Logic Apps is a cloud service that helps you schedule, automate, and orchestrate tasks, business processes, and workflows when you need to integrate apps, data, systems, and services across enterprises or organizations. Logic Apps simplifies how you design and build scalable solutions for app integration, data integration, system integration, enterprise application integration, and business-to-business communication, whether in the cloud, on-premises, or both. Now, if this sounds a lot like Power Automate, that's because they are actually pretty similar. So what is the difference between Logic Apps and Power Automate? First off, Power Automate is offered as software as a service. So you have a license based on your Office 365 subscription, and it's a per user, per execution type of licensing. Whereas Logic Apps is offered as platform as a service. Because it's offered as platform as a service, you have the power to use the full Azure stack to build your solutions. So while both products facilitate workflow automation across apps, Logic Apps are really meant to let you talk to applications outside of your organization, whereas Power Automate is really meant to help you automate workflows across your applications within your enterprise. Now, once we get into Logic Apps, we will see that it's targeted a little bit more towards the developer, whereas Power Automate is targeted towards a power user. Another benefit of Logic Apps is it can extend Power Automate. So as we all know, in Power Automate and Logic Apps, we have hundreds of different connectors to talk to a lot of different kinds of products. If for some reason you need to talk to a product that doesn't have a connector, you can build your own custom connector and make it available in Power Automate using Logic Apps, for example. Logic Apps provides flexibility for advanced integration, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Power Automate is actually built on top of Logic Apps. So once we get in there, you will see that the two not only sound familiar, but they look almost exactly the same because Power Automate is built on top of Logic Apps. And finally, we talked about the pricing a little bit. So this is a per user price based on an Office 365 subscription. This requires an Azure subscription for the Logic Apps. And then the pricing is really done per execution. It has nothing to do, it's not bound to any users or anything like that. Okay, so let's jump over into Azure and get started. I have to create a couple of things here to get us started. So the first thing we're going to create is we're going to create a service bus. And let me get that started. And we'll explain what a service bus is in a second and what we're going to be using it for. Now, for most integrations we'll be doing, the standard pricing tier here is going to be fine. Unless you're dealing with like millions of records or anything like that, you could always go for the standard tier. You don't need to worry about selecting this premium one. So let's go ahead and create our service bus. And then we're also going to create a log analytics workspace. So log analytics workspace in Azure is basically a data store for us to store logs in. So this is what we're going to be storing for doing error handling, reprocessing failed records, and things of that nature. All right. So let's get that created. Now it does take a few minutes to get these resources created. So while we're doing that, we'll jump back into the PowerPoint presentation and talk about what we just created. So what is the Azure Service Bus? Azure Service Bus is a fully managed enterprise message broker with message queues and publish-subscribe topics. Service Bus is used to decouple applications and services from each other, providing the following benefits. So typically, when doing integrations with Dynamics 365 products, historically speaking, we would always use some sort of third-party tool like Scribe or Kingsway Soft. And then we would do like some sort of query-based integration, which tracks the last time that the application ran against the modified date time on a record and gets us the result set which has changed. And then we do a one-by-one type of processing on those records to integrate them to other systems. So using an Azure Service Bus is a completely different architecture. And Microsoft is moving towards using this more and more with their products. As you'll see now, this is fully integrated already within Dynamics 365 Customer Engagement, and it's already fully integrated with Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations. And then this will also be coming in the near future for Business Central. So what is the Service Bus thing exactly? So what it does is it allows us to create these message queues. And every time that an event happens that we want to listen to, we're going to write a message to the message queue, okay? This allows us to decouple the integrations so that the sending application and the receiving application are independent of each other and don't rely on each other. This has many different benefits. One of them is being able to do load balancing. As anybody knows who's ever worked with Scribe, if you're working with a large data set, it could take a very, very long time to finish integrating records. Whereas if we use this method that we're going to show now, we're going to be able to use throttling to push multiple records at the same time. So this adds a very big benefit when you have some sort of load balancing that needs to happen. Also, when you're using just a query-based integration, if there's ever a failure of one record for some reason, it usually fails the whole record set. And then rerunning records and doing stuff like that becomes a real challenge. So using message queues provides a safe way to route and transfer data across services and applications by using message queues instead. So this also allows us to coordinate transactional work that requires a high degree of reliability. As you guys know, once you've done a query-based integration, we just mentioned this, if you have a failure, it's not going to run again on the next run. So what do? You have to go in and modify the records again and push them to make sure that the data integrates. Well, by using this decoupled approach, all that's going to happen is when the change that you're looking for happens, a message is going to be pushed into a message queue. So at that point, you can take that message and do whatever you want with it and keep it there until you are done with your integration. So this will really help you have some sort of fault tolerance where if for some reason the integration fails, the message remains in the queue and we have automatic retries. So all of these features come built in with Azure Service Bus. I'm really not doing it a great service with this brief introduction. I encourage you to go read into it and learn about it more. But as I said, it does integrate out of the box with Dynamics 365, and that's what we're going to be using to build our integrations today. And as you see here, my log analytics workspace is finished deploying, and then my Azure Service Bus has finished deploying. So let's go over to the service bus. So what we're going to be using the service bus for is to create these queues for these different events that we want to listen to. And then we're going to register these events in CRM so that when there's a change that happens, we get a message in our queue here. Then we're going to have a logic app that monitors this queue and uses Twilio to send out a text message to the customer. So let's go ahead and get everything set up. So let's create our queues. So we're going to be using cases in CRM to model this. So let's, our first queue is going to be called case. There's some settings here. Basically, this is going to be the number of retries that a message is going to try to be delivered before it gets moved to a dead letter queue. So a dead letter queue is a built-in feature of Service Bus, which means that a message remains in the queue for a certain number of retries. When that number of retries has been reached, Service Bus will automatically move the message to a dead letter queue. So that means it will no longer be reprocessed. However, because it's moving to a dead letter queue, you can very easily retrieve it and reprocess it later. There's a little bit of a manual process to that, but that's one of the benefits of using the Service Bus, as it provides built-in fault tolerance because of this dead lettering feature. So we're going to enable dead lettering on message expiration, and we're going to set the max delivery count to 10, and we're going to create our queue. Okay, so now I have this little tool called Azure Service Bus Explorer, which you can download from Microsoft, and it allows you to browse an Azure Service Bus. So we're going to come into our Service Bus here. We're going to go to the shared access policies, and by default, there's this root key that's created, and then I'm going to copy the primary connection string. And then over here in my Service Bus Explorer, I am going to create a new connection, and I'm going to say enter connection string, and then I'm going to paste that connection string in here. So now, as you see, I can see my queue that's been created here, and currently it has 0 messages in it. So now let's jump over to Dynamics 365 and register an event so that anytime that there's a change that happens, we get a message in this queue here. So to do that, I'm going to jump over to the plugin registration tool. And this was added a little while ago, but now if you go under the Register tab, instead of just being able to register an assembly or step or an image, we can now register a new service endpoint. So we're going to register a service endpoint, and we're going to paste that same connection string that we just used. And that's going to fill out all this information that we need here. The only other thing we need to do is put the queue name, and then we're going to change this message format. So we want to work with JSON. Logic apps work great with JSON. Always use JSON unless you have a really good reason to use anything else. And then we do want to send the user ID of the user that initiated the action. So now we've registered the service endpoint. And now we can register a step just like we do with any plugin. So over here, I'm going to register a new step. And basically, all I'm going to do is whenever I have a create of a case, I want to be notified of this action so that I can send a text message to my user. I want this to happen asynchronously, and I'm going to go ahead and register my step. Okay, so now let's jump over into CRM. Sorry, old habits die hard. Shouldn't be calling it CRM. Let's jump back into customer engagement and take a look at what we have here. So basically, now every time I create a case here, so let's say BMW service. So this is our car dealership. Whenever they start work on a car, they're going to create a case record in D365 customer engagement. And what we want is we just want to send a simple text message to the customer acknowledging that service on the vehicle has started. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay. So now over here in our service bus, if we refresh this queue, we should be seeing a message come in here shortly. So while we're waiting for that to go over, it is an async task, so it does sometimes take a few seconds. Let's go back over here. And let's create our first logic app, which is actually going to read from the service bus, and then we're going to use that to do our integration. So I'm going to hit the add button here, and I'm going to create a logic app. So I'm going to call this outbound SMS, just for simplicity's sake. Now, I'm not going to associate this with an integration service environment. This is a whole topic in of itself. We're not going to really cover in too much detail, but Microsoft does have a solution which allows you to create an integration account that allows you to do XML transformations with things like XSLT and things like that. It's very complicated and not very user-friendly. I don't really recommend doing it, so we're not going to be covering that. We are, however, going to enable log analytics, and we're going to select the log analytics workspace that we just created earlier so that our executions are being logged to this log analytics workspace here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create my logic app. Okay, so once I do that, I'm going to be taken to this page which shows a bunch of templates for the logic apps. So the template that I want to use is actually this peak lock, receive a service bus message, and complete it. So if I click that and I say use this template, it's going to ask me to create a connection to service bus. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm just going to call it service bus 1. There's the service bus we just created. There's the access policy. Okay, so that creates a connection to the service bus. And now we have these two steps here. So what this is going to do is it's going to do a peak lock. What that means is it's going to read the contents of the message, but it's going to keep it in the queue until we complete the message using this step. And what you'll see is this step will actually provide you with a lock token, and we're using that lock token with the delete step here to delete the message after it's done. Now, because I'm doing a demo and I don't want to keep pushing messages, I'm actually going to delete this step for now, and we're just going to have the step that reads the message. Okay, over here, I put the name of the queue that I want to monitor, and then I can put how often I want the queue to be monitored here. I'm just going to do this 3-minute interval. Okay, so now if we jump back over to the Azure Service Bus Explorer, we will see that we have one message in our queue now. Okay, so let's set up this logic app that reads from that queue, and let's see what happens. So if I save this, it's going to enable the logic app, and it's going to run. Now, like I said, because the message is still in the queue, it's going to continue to run, and I don't want it to. I just want it to run once and stop. So I disabled the app, and I have my one execution here. And I will see that it got triggered because I have that message in the queue. Okay? So let's decode this message a little bit and see what it looks like. So we're going to jump back into our logic app. And we want to use this data operation step to parse the JSON. And then we're going to pass it the message content from here. So now this does come encrypted in base 64 or encoded in base 64, so you do have to decode it. There's an expression to do that here, decode base 64. And then I'm going to pass in the content of the message from the first step. Okay, and then for my schema, I'm actually going to leave this empty for now. Okay, but over here you define a schema. The reason you define a schema is this step will actually parse the JSON and give you easy to use tokens that you can then use later in your app to do easier integration. So we'll see what I'm talking about in a second here. Let's just save this. Okay, and I'm going to show you another pleasure of working with these logic apps, which again, we only had one execution here, and then I disabled my app. So if I want to resubmit the app and I want to rerun this just one message, I can hit this resubmit button. And even though the app is disabled, it's not actually going to go out and read the message. It's just going to replay this action here. So I can go ahead and test my changes that I just did. So if I refresh here, now I have two steps in my logic app. So the message arrives, we decode it, and then we can see the raw output of the message here. So if we look in here, we can see that it's sending a bunch of data from customer engagement, and then it's also sending the context of the action, basically, which is pretty much the same thing that you see in the plugin context if you're registering a plugin. Now, in my experience, you can probably get this parse JSON step to parse the data that you need for the integration from here. But because of the way the data is structured with relationships and all that, building the schema becomes really hard. So what I prefer to do is I'll just take this message over here. I'm just going to take the body. And let's just copy it over here. Okay, really all the data that I need is right here. I just need to know the primary entity name and the primary entity ID. And then if I wanted to set up an ignore user, for example, I could use this user ID. Otherwise, I can just get rid of all this stuff here. So there's really the schema that I care about. So now if I jump in to my logic app, I can use this sample payload to generate schema, and I can put in the fields that I want to read, and it will auto-generate the schema for me. Okay? So now what I can do with that, now I know that this is always going to be a case because that's the queue that I'm monitoring. And by reading this primary entity ID field, I can go look up this case record in CRM. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to create a common data service connection. I'm going to get a record. Okay. And here I can sign in using a regular user, but whenever you're doing integrations with customer engagement, I always suggest using an application user. So I already have an application user set up here that we're going to use. Let me grab the client ID from here. And then we need the tenant ID from here. And then the client secret, which I cheated and I saved it over here. Okay. So now we create our connection. I'm going to select the environment. So we have a case. And then for the identifier, I'm going to use this primary entity ID. We're going to rename the step. Okay, so we're going to get the case, and then we're going to get the associated account. And here, I'm going to get that from the output of the get case step, which is going to be the customer here. Okay, so let's save this, go back here, and use this cool resubmit button to rerun our workflow and see what's happening now. Okay, so we see here it went out and it was able to grab the case. And then it was able to go out and grab the account. So now we have the name of the account, and we have the phone number of the customer. Okay? So this is another reason why Logic Apps are amazing. There's actually more than 200 built-in connectors to all kinds of stuff that you can talk to. So, Dynamics 365 customer engagement, Business Central, Finance Ops, Excel, OneDrive, Azure Blob Storage. I mean, there's just countless connectors. So for our purposes today for this demo, we're going to be sending SMS messages out. We're going to use a service called Twilio, which also has a connector in here. So I signed up for a free Twilio account. And when you sign up for the account, you get this account ID and token. And that's what we're going to use to send our text message. So let's come over here. See, we have a Twilio connector. And I want to send an SMS message. Now it's going to ask me to authenticate. I put my account ID. Put my token, and I hit create. Okay, so now it's going to send from a phone number that I have set up already. So I've already set up a Twilio phone number that I can send text messages from. I select it here. So now here I'm going to put the phone number that's going to go out to, and on the account record, I believe that's main phone. Okay, and then for the text of the message, I am going to put hello, account name, service has started on your vehicle. We will contact you when it's ready to be picked up. Okay, let's save that. Okay, and then we come back over here and let's rerun our workflow. Okay, and we have a text message. All right, so I have this cool SMS app on my phone that allows me to see the text messages from my phone. And as you can see here, I just got a text message that says, hello, Ramsey Kandah. Service has started on your vehicle. We will contact you when it's ready to be picked up. Okay, so that pretty much sums up the first part of our integration. There is one more thing that I want to show. So let's just take a look at that real quick. And we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail later on once we look at the logging. But if we go to these steps, any step in Logic Apps, you can go to the settings, and there's these things called tracked properties. Tracked properties basically allow you to capture output from anywhere in your app and write it to the logs. So for example, if I wanted to log the case number for this integration, I can log it here. Or if I wanted to log the account number or the account name or the phone number of the customer, I can do that by using these tracked properties. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to track the case number. Okay, and then go to my cheat sheet over here. This will give us the ticket number field, which is the case number, and log it. And then over here, we're going to actually log the account name, which on the account record will be called name, and then phone number. Okay. And then the last step we wanted to do was, if you remember, I deleted the message in the beginning that clears the message from the bus. We actually want to put that back. But before I do that, I am actually going to run it a few more times just so we get some executions in the execution log so that we can look at that. So I'm just going to hit resubmit here a few times. Okay. And as that's happening, you will see we will get more and more text messages in here momentarily. Okay. So while we're waiting for that and for the log to populate, let's take a look at a couple more things here. So now we've done an outbound integration. We've basically captured the event that we're looking for that happens in a customer engagement, and we wrote it to Service Bus. All this was done using built-in functionality. You saw how the Service Bus natively integrates with a customer engagement using the plugin registration tool. And then we have a logic app that monitors this queue and then pushes it over. So now let's say we want to actually allow the customer to reply to the text message. And whenever they reply to the text message, we want to log that as a note inside of customer engagement. So let's go ahead and try to do that. So to do that, Twilio actually has this nice feature which allows you to send an HTTP request anywhere you want whenever you have an incoming message. So similar to how Dynamics 365 posts a message to a queue, this will actually send an HTTP request with the contents of the text message. So we're going to set up a logic app here that listens to that call from Twilio. So we're going to go ahead and add another logic app. Okay. And this one is going to be called inbound SMS. And we're going to associate it with our log analytics workspace. And we're going to create it. And again, this will take us to the page where we select a template for our logic app. So for this one, we're going to select this when an HTTP request is received. Okay? So again, it's just a blank app with a trigger right now. It's going to be an HTTP request that triggers this. Once you hit save, you will actually get a URL to this endpoint that you just created. So we're going to copy that URL. So I've configured my endpoint here in Twilio. I hit save. And now I go back to my messaging app here, and I can send a text message. And if I jump back into Azure, I will see that every time that I send a text message, it's actually triggering this logic app here. So I'm not going to go into the whole detail of how to create this portion of it. You will see here that it actually has the country, the state that the message came from, the city, zip. It will have the body of the SMS, and then it will have the value of the phone number. So what we would do here is we would go do a lookup in customer engagement to get the customer. We would go look up their open cases, and then we can create an annotation record on the case whenever they communicate. And by using these tools, we've created a two-way integration between SMS and Dynamics 365 customer engagement. So we're getting pretty close to the time here. I would like to just talk about one more thing before we wrap up. So you saw how we were setting everything up with a log analytics workspace. So I just want you guys to see what that looks like. So if we come in here and we go into log analytics workspace, and then we go to workspace summary, now you'll see that there's a solution that's created in here that logs all of your logic app executions. Now this is great because you can come in here and drill in by integration and view all of your executions in one place and do some filtering on times, all kinds of stuff that you could do here. But the really cool thing about this is you can access the tracked properties that we set up in the steps while we were doing the logic app integration. So you can now, if somebody calls you, for example, and you need to go look up, hey, what happened with the SMS for this specific case number? You can just come to this page and you can filter here and search by the case number. You can search by the phone number. So for example, here I can come and search by the customer phone number. And that'll filter out all the messages for me, which have that phone number. So this really, really helps when debugging and looking for failed executions. One of the things that I have always hated about using these large ETL tools is you always have to fish out one record out of an integration that was like hundreds or thousands of records. By using this platform as a service solution, you're really able to decouple everything and separate the sender from the receiver. You're also able to execute one message at a time, which provides you great debugging flexibility and the ability to resubmit messages, which you could do from this solution here. Please drop me any questions you have in the chat. I know we've covered a lot today. Thank you guys so much for listening to my session, and I'm looking forward to catch up with you later. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Q&A session. Thanks for watching all the way through. We made it to the end. So let's get started here by answering a couple of the questions we got in the chat. So one of the questions was, can it send out a custom birthday gift? So that's actually one of the things that I really like about the Logic apps is, there's only so much you can do sometimes inside of the Logic app itself. But because you're using the Azure stack, what you can actually do is build an Azure function. And that could be a custom piece of code that does anything you want using C#, .NET, all these different types of languages to do any custom action you want. So that way, when you run across these scenarios, when you want to do something really complicated and you get stuck with a normal integration tool, in Azure, you don't really have these limitations because you're able to break out into a custom piece of code, basically, do anything crazy custom that you need to do there, and then send the result back to the Logic app so that you can send the email to the customer using the Logic app, for example. Another few things I wanted to talk about a little bit that I feel like I didn't get to cover during my session. We talked in the very beginning about this concept of parallelism. So I just wanted to show what that looks like real quick. So let me share my screen here. So whenever you're working with the Logic apps, and this is available anytime you have a trigger. So in this case, the trigger for my Logic app was when a message is received in a queue. You can go to the settings here, and there's actually a setting for concurrency control. And if you turn this on, you have this setting called degree of parallelism. This will actually control how many instances of the logic app are running at once. And this allows you to control things like throttling limits. So if you have a lot of data coming out of CRM, for example, and then you want to send it to an API that can't handle that many records at once, you want to slow it down, you can control the degree of parallelism here to control how many executions are happening in parallel. But just as you can use it to throttle, this is also an advantage when integrating millions and millions of records. One of the limitations that we always have with classic ETL tools is we're integrating one record at a time. With this, it'll actually scale up to however many executions you could do in parallel, which allows you to process millions of records sometimes in something like half an hour, whereas before, when you're doing one record at a time, it would take days to do that. So just to expand a little bit on this idea, I wanted to show, so this is what the inbound text message app would end up looking like if we built it out completely. So I have this here working when an HTTP request is received. I actually have to do a lookup in CRM because I have to get the account based on the phone number, and then I have to get the case based on the account. And then in here, I have a step to create a note inside of CRM with the incoming text message from the customer. So normally, again, with the ETL tool, now when you're running this one action at a time, it's going to be really slow because it has to go do this lookup, take the result, do this lookup, and then take the result and create this record. Well, similar to what we showed with the settings tab over here, all these for each loops that sometimes you're forced to create in your logic app also have this similar setting to where you can control the degree of parallelism. So even when you're looping through your app, you have the option to make it run faster by running in parallel. This is a huge advantage when integrating large data sets that really you don't have these options with classic ETL tools that we normally use for integration. Another thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit that I didn't get to cover during my session is the built-in logging that, well, we talked about the built-in logging, but the alerting that's built into Azure. So this is another great thing is if you want to get alerted, for example, when you have failures in your logic app, you don't have to put that logic inside of your workflow. You can actually come here and create these alerts. And these alerts are great because you can basically hone in on the resource that you want to monitor for the alert. And then you have all these built-in conditions. So you can monitor things like latency, whether, let's say I haven't had a message outbound for the last 3 hours and I want to log when that happens, or I want to get alerted when an action fails. So you just select the things that you want to get alerted for and you say, okay, so if I have more failures than one in the last 5 minutes, and it's going to check every minute, if this is true, it will basically follow whatever is in this action group. And these action groups that you can create, you can put email addresses in here, and you can actually put phone numbers as well. So it could send out SMS text messages if you like. So that's another great built-in feature with the logic apps that, again, you're leveraging the power of Azure to solve a lot of these common problems that come when you're trying to integrate different systems together. So another question we got in the chat, Flow doesn't allow you to use Azure Functions. So that is correct. You cannot call out to an Azure function directly from Flow. You can do HTTP requests and talk to an Azure function that way, but usually your target audience with Flow is, more like power users and end users, more so than IT folk. So for them to, figure out what the HTTP request needs to look like and work that way is very difficult. So typically what you can do though, is using logic apps, you can actually create a you can create a custom API. So you can create an Azure function, and there's something called a custom API that you can also provide through Azure. And then what that allows you to do is to expose your Azure function as a custom connector inside of Flow. So if you wanted to do a custom connector inside of Flow, you actually do it using an Azure function, but the way to do it is using Logic Apps, because that's where you would have to create the Azure function and the custom API, and then from there you can make it available inside of Flow. So where do I see people using Power Automate when they should be using Logic Apps? So this is a great question. I think Power Automate is going to be geared more towards personal workflows. Like if I'm trying to automate some of my personal tasks, that's going to be a big driver. It's not something where I want to be managing integrations for the whole enterprise. Okay. So Logic Apps is more geared, in my opinion, towards enterprise integration. Power Automate is geared more towards creating personal workflows. So that's a very big distinction. Another big distinction is really Flow is meant within the organization. So if you're talking about using apps across the Microsoft stack within the organization, then it's a good idea to use Flow and Power Automate. But if you are going to be talking to some other another API outside of your organization, then it's more recommended to use enterprise integration tools, and by default you would use Logic Apps for that. Okay. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Let me just move this out of the way. Another thing that always comes up is, okay, so this is great for, when you have a connector that works with the product that you want to integrate with. So we showed how Dynamics 365 Customer Engagement actually has a connector for talking to Azure. Azure has a connector to talk to Dynamics 365. There's a connector for finance and ops. There's a connector for customer engagement. There's a connector that's in preview for Business Central, but it's not available yet. So we can't use it. For things like Dynamics GP, there's still a lot of customers that use Dynamics GP. There is no connector for Dynamics GP. But the good news is, because you're using the power of Azure, and because you can build an Azure function that basically does whatever you want, by combining that and an Azure on-premise gateway, we can actually build our own solution that allows us to create a custom Dynamics GP connector, for example, or a custom BC connector. Now, when you're doing stuff like that, you are going to have some development knowledge of whatever system you're integrating with. So that adds a little bit of complexity. But when you're stuck in these situations where there's no connector for the application that you want to talk to, if you still want to use Azure and Logic Apps to do your integration, then that's a great idea to be able to do that as well. So I think that's everything I had to cover. Is there any more questions from the crowd? If not, I think we'll be ready to wrap up pretty soon here.